Well, good evening, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. It is 6 o'clock, so I want to go ahead and welcome everyone here. We have a great turnout this evening, so hopefully all of you that have come, hopefully this will be time well spent for you all. We welcome you and thank you for coming. Okay, Mr. Hemmelwright.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The public comment period is now open. I see no names, no one has signed up at this point. Is there anybody in the audience or member of the public who wishes to comment on tonight's presentation? Seeing none, as a Citizens Advisory Board to the Department of Energy on environmental cleanup, we want to encourage the community at large to attend and participate in our board and committee meetings. If you are unable to attend, please send in your questions and comments to the address shown on the screen. Appropriate comments and questions will be read during the public comment section of the board meeting and will be given the same consideration by the board and by the Department of Energy as those given in persons. Meeting schedules and ways to communicate with the board can be obtained by calling 241-4583 or visiting our website. Public comment period is now closed.
All right, our presenter tonight is Mr. Brian Henry. And Mr. Henry serves as the Senior Project Manager for Oak Ridge Environmental Management, responsible for managing and overseeing the Environmental Management Waste Management Facility, commonly known as the EMWMF, the Y-12 sanitary landfills, and the effort for a new environmental management disposal facility called the EMDF. Mr. Henry.
Okay, I have a clear mandate from my boss to avoid acronyms, so of course the first thing I'm going to do is show you an acronym. So I'm here to talk about and give you an update on the CERCLA waste disposal capacity on the Oak Ridge Reservation. And CERCLA, most of you know, but it stands for the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act of 1980. And it's also commonly referred to as the Superfund Act, which is what some of you may know it by. So EM is responsible for cleaning up legacy facilities from the Manhattan era and Cold War activities, and a lot of that falls under CERCLA decisions, which establishes the framework for the cleanup. All right, let's see if I can make this work. Oh, okay. So the Oak Ridge Reservation is outlined in purple on this slide, and it's more than 30,000 acres, approximately 34,000. And there are three main industrial areas within the Oak Ridge Reservation. You have the East Tennessee Technology Park. It is a former uranium enrichment facility, and as Sue mentioned, it is quickly being cleaned up, and they're going to hit a wonderful milestone in 2016. You have the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which is a world-class laboratory. You have Y-12 National Security Complex. And both ORNL and Y-12 have legacy facilities that EM is responsible for that sit alongside mission facilities. And it's the cleanup primarily of the future cleanup of ORNL and Y-12 legacy facilities that is driving the need for additional CERCLA waste disposal capacity. I'll also point out right there is our existing on-site CERCLA disposal facility. This right here is just a basic diagram of what a low-level radioactive waste disposal facility looks like on the reservation. This is representative of both our existing facility and our future facility that's in the planning. There are two main components to the disposal facility that ensure protectiveness. You have a liner system that's 5 foot thick that includes geosynthetic membranes. You have a 10-foot geologic buffer, so you have a total of 15 foot between the waste and the native materials. In between that and the cover system, you can fit up to 75 feet of waste. And then there's a final cover system that goes on top of that, and that will be anywhere from 11 to 14 foot in thickness. The conceptual design for the new on-site disposal facility has the cover at 11 foot. The approved design for the existing one currently has a 14-foot cover, but based on some recommendations, we're working with the regulators to get a 11-foot cover design for that. The existing facility, once it's covered, is about 43 acres. It is approximately, the disposal capacity airspace is approximately 2.18 million cubic yards. It's currently about 70% full, and it's been operational since 2002. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to need a new facility as we move into ORNL and Y12 and complete cleanup over the next several decades. So in evaluating the need for an on-site disposal facility for a new one and going through the CERCLA process, there's what's called a remedial investigation and feasibility study. And that's where we are in the CERCLA process, and that's where we do an evaluation of different alternatives. A lot of you know that we're into several versions on that particular document. The previous versions basically went through several screening steps and did a final screening to select one preferred site. In discussions with the regulators over the past months, we decided that it was prudent to include additional on-site alternatives and an additional hybrid alternative, which I'll talk to later. I'll also mention that there are some posters around the room that show the different alternatives, and those will remain up if you want to look at those later. Okay, we essentially have 6 alternatives being considered in the CERCLA process. The first is a no-action alternative, and that's required as part of the CERCLA process, and it's not an alternative that is expected to be selected. We have now 3 on-site alternatives that are being considered. The off-site disposal alternative is under consideration, as it has been in previous versions. I will point out in this map right here, it's a little small. You can see it a little better on this poster. The off-site facilities are located in Utah and Nevada. The commercial facility, the waste would be trucked by rail out to that facility. For the facility in Nevada, some of the waste has to be trucked, and some waste can go by rail most of the way, but then has to be transferred to truck for the final portion. And it, as you can see from the map, to get to the off-site disposal facilities requires crossing a large part of the country and multiple states. EPA and TDEC also expressed a desire to include a hybrid alternative in this version that included a smaller on-site cell with more of the waste going off-site, which we did. So how did we get narrowed down to the alternatives that are in the RIFIS, the feasibility study? We started by looking at all across the reservation. And so this map shows you the entire reservation and the boundary. It shows 16 sites that were part of the initial screening for locating a new disposal cell. These 16 sites, or some version of them, were also considered in siting of the previous on-site disposal cell. A couple of things I'll point out on the map. There are the colors there represent different geologic formations. Some geologic formations are more suitable for on-site disposal, and some are not really suited for on-site disposal. So this is another map that shows a little bit different information and only shows the alternatives that are now in this version of the RIFIS. Most of you probably know, but the Oak Ridge Reservation is a prime example of ridge and valley geologic formation. And those hatched areas that run east to west represent steep slopes, and that's where a lot of the ridges are located. So you have ridges that run east and west, and then you have valleys in between. When we were looking to determine the best site for a new on-site disposal facility, that was one of the considerations, steep slopes. The peach color also represents the geologic formations that I mentioned earlier that are prone to karst, which don't really make a good location for an on-site disposal facility. So when we started looking at all those considerations, and another one of the considerations was hydrology, and that's how much seep springs, streams are located within the footprint. And since most of you live here in East Tennessee, you know we get a lot of rain, about 55 inches per year. So there's a lot of water that goes into the system. So the three on-site alternatives that involve 4 locations, all are in Bear Creek Valley, which are shown in this general area. And I'll talk more about each one of those in just a moment. So a little bit of the background on CERCLA decisions across the Oak Ridge Reservation. As I mentioned, the reservation is large, and they were looking at how they were going to set the stage for cleanup. The decision was made to look at watersheds. Because of the ridge and valley, it basically leads to clearly defined watersheds, and so past CERCLA decisions were based on watersheds. And this map here that includes the zones, that's in the Bear Creek Valley watershed, and there's a CERCLA decision document that talks about the future land use, which drives the levels of cleanup for that particular effort. And the alternatives are cited in 3 different zones from that Phase 1 Bear Creek record of decision. The area, I'm going to call it gold. In that decision, the future land use was determined to be industrial. For Zone 2, the short-term land use for cleanup purposes was determined to be recreational with a long-term goal of unrestricted use. And Zone 1 is unrestricted use. I want to point out, as I was talking about watersheds, from this eastern edge of that Zone 3, water generally flows this way down Bear Creek Valley. When you're in Y12, it's in a different watershed, and water generally flows this way. There is a significant ridge that we will see in several of the other slides that serves as a northern boundary for Bear Creek Valley. So for the on-site disposal alternatives, we have 2 sites that can accommodate the full amount of projected waste. One of those is located right in the middle, in between Y12, the existing on-site disposal facility, and a lot of other buried waste areas. The West Bear Creek Valley site can also accommodate the full amount of projected waste. As you'll notice, it's currently in a greenfield area. Essentially, all of Zone 3 is a brownfield area. There is a dual site option that involves 2 smaller landfills. One of those would be right next to the existing on-site facility, and the other one would be here as depicted in 7A, which would be in a greenfield. So the dual site has 1 site in a greenfield, 1 site in a brownfield. As I mentioned earlier, TDEC and EPA had the desire for us to include another option that involved a small on-site disposal facility with the majority of the waste going off-site. Working with the regulators, we chose Site 6B as the representative site for that hybrid option, primarily because that site involves the least amount of surface water features, and it's also right next to EMWMF, and so it could share the majority of the infrastructure that's already in place. The capacity of that particular site is only about 850,000 cubic yards. We are designing a landfill that can hold up to 2.5 million cubic yards. Our most likely scenario at this point is about 2.2 million cubic yards. So the majority of the waste under that hybrid option would be bound for off-site disposal. Okay, I like this picture. It gives you a really good view of Bear Creek Valley, and it kind of lays out the location of the different alternatives. You can clearly see the prominent ridge that serves as the northern boundary of Bear Creek Valley, and that does serve as a distinct watershed boundary. This blue line here is a rough approximation of the west end of the Y-12 National Security Complex. Water generally east of this, you can't see in this picture, but water on this side generally flows to the east, and all the water in this picture flows to the west. Bear Creek Valley is bounded by ridges on either side. This one is more prominent, but generally the water flows from the ridges into the center of the valley, and Bear Creek, which runs down the center of the valley, it flows down toward Bear Creek and then west. So the East Bear Creek Valley site is sited here. It is within the Y-12 boundary. It is just east of our existing on-site disposal facility. The two dual site locations I mentioned are located west of the existing on-site disposal facility, one of which is directly next to the existing one, and this one also serves as the on-site portion for the hybrid alternative. When you look down toward the West Bear Creek Valley site, it looks small. That's representative of distance. It's actually a larger site that can accommodate the total projected volume of waste and actually could accommodate a little more. I also want to point out the haul road, which is an important aspect of on-site disposal. Essentially, all the waste coming from Y-12 and O&L has a dedicated haul road that can go to these on-site locations without leaving the reservation, without getting into and out into public roads. I wanted to highlight some of the benefits of on-site disposal. I want to start by pointing out this graph here, which is a chart of the life cycle cost of all the different options. I want to make it very clear that those life cycle costs include the planning, design, the construction of all 6 cells of a new facility, and all the operations costs during its projected 20-year operational life, and the final cap and closure and the demolition of all the ancillary facilities. So these costs are life cycle costs that spread out into 2040 something. I can't remember the exact date. The on-site disposal facility is expected to be constructed in phases. Conceptually, we see that occurring in 3 phases of 2 cells each. The first project that we're talking about when we get to the schedule only consists of the first 2 phases, about 1/3 of the capacity, and we're projecting that project to come in the neighborhood of $100 million. So these costs that are showing here, again, represent the life cycle cost over the next 30 years. I keep trying to point with my clicker, so I need to. All right. So we talk about a delta between the 2 on-site options that can accommodate the full projected volume of waste and the off-site option in the RIFUS, and that delta is about $800 million over the life cycle. So if one of the on-site alternatives were selected that accommodates the full volume of waste, that would save over the life cycle about $800 million over the off-site option. Another key benefit of the on-site option has to do with the transportation risks, and that's what's shown here in the bottom left corner. These risks are based and taken from published transportation data, and they represent the projected fatalities and projected injuries associated with the waste trucks or the waste shipments over the distances to the landfills. And of course, with the on-site being much closer, those risks are much lower. Off-site has, as you can see from here, there are a lot of miles that have to be traveled to get to the off-site locations, so that represents additional transportation risk. Another key benefit of on-site disposal is having local control of our destiny, so to speak. We've recently experienced with WIP, I think most of you are familiar, that facility has been shut down for a number of years.
Since February of 14.
Okay, which has impacted our schedule for getting some of our waste streams out of Oak Ridge, and it's impacting both schedule and cost. So having an on-site facility where you're in control, along with your regulators, who never let you take complete control, you're in a better position to mitigate program risks and to control your on-site, your destiny. I didn't mention earlier, but I want to make it very clear that all of the on-site alternatives include some portion of off-site disposal. So historically, about 90% of the waste by volume has gone into on-site. And higher activity waste or high hazard waste that is not suitable for on-site disposal because it doesn't meet the criteria for disposal gets shipped off-site. And that 10% actually represents about 90% of the activity and the hazard associated with the cleanup. Those are rough numbers. And also another significant benefit of the cleanup in Oak Ridge is an economic one. A strong EM cleanup program represents a significant economic benefit to all of our local communities. Okay, so as we work through the RIFIS, one of the key things we try to do is differentiate between the on-site alternatives to present the basis for us to select an alternative in the future. So this table summarizes some of the key aspects of the differences between the on-site alternatives. We have the brownfield site in East Bear Creek Valley, the greenfield site in West Bear Creek Valley. Again, when you look at the capacity, both of those can handle the projected waste volumes. These two are the dual site. Site 6B can handle about 850,000 cubic yards, and Site 7A can handle about 1.4 million cubic yards. Together, their capacity is about 2.2 million cubic yards. As I mentioned earlier, in general, we're designed to handle up to 2.5 million cubic yards, but our most likely volume at this point is in the 2.2 million range, and that one together will do about 2.25. I will mention again that these costs you see here are life cycle costs over the planning, design, construction of all three phases, the operational period of about 20 years, final closure and capping, and demolition of the ancillary facilities. So based on their location, some of the locations can share infrastructure with the existing on-site disposal facility, which is a plus. So the East Bear Creek Valley site can share some of the infrastructure. Site 6B, which is a smaller site right next to our existing on-site disposal facility, can share most of the infrastructure. 7A and the West Bear Creek Valley site both would require new infrastructure. So this column here represents the proximity to the nearest resident. They all are about a mile, some a little more, some a little less. The state, this column here talks about hydrology management. And when I'm talking about hydrology, I'm talking about seeps, springs, streams that are in the area that we're going to construct a landfill. Some of the sites will require a major underdrain because the East Bear Creek Valley site crosses a tributary, so there's a major underdrain system to drain those areas. The West Bear Creek Valley site has a moderate underdrain. There are a few wetlands and potentially a seasonal stream in that area. 6B and 7A were sited essentially in between tributaries, so they do not rely as much on an underdrain system. And as I mentioned earlier, Site 6B has the least impact to surface water, and that's why it was selected as the hybrid alternative. We also took into consideration the proximity of the new landfill to current waste disposal areas and to current industrial areas and future land use. So this column here summarizes that. As I mentioned, I'm going to point over to one of the posters. That's the brownfield site, and you can see that it is clearly right in between the Y12 site, the existing on-site disposal facility, and multiple other buried waste areas. All right, let's go to the other site that can accommodate the full waste, and that's this one over here. And you'll notice it's essentially in a forested area that is a green field. Site 6B, right here. Again, it's right next to our existing disposal facility, and also on this side is another large buried waste area that will be the subject of a future cleanup decision. And 7A, which is essentially also in a greenfield area, but it is a little closer to the other buried waste areas in our existing facility. Okay, so this shows our proposed schedule and where we are today. As I mentioned, we're going through the CERCLA process, which involves where we are now at the remedial investigation feasibility study. We have a milestone for the end of June for the initial version of the proposed plan. And we're moving hopefully toward a record decision, which is regulatory agreement in 2017. We submitted our most recent version of the RIFIS to the regulators in March. They have 60 days to review and approve that document. We do expect that we will be in what's called informal dispute, and that is a normal part of the CERCLA process. And one advantage of that is it will get all of the parties focused on resolving the remaining actions as quickly as possible so that we can move forward. Now, the official opportunity to solicit public comment comes after the proposed plan and the issue of the proposed plan. However, DOE is committing to sharing information and making information available about our process and evaluation of alternatives in selecting a new site ahead of that proposed plan. So we want to do as much as possible even before that communication period. Back to the schedule, I've essentially been talking about the next 2 years, which will hopefully see us through the main part of the discussions with the regulators. Assuming we get through that, then we'll start the detailed design for about the next 2 years. We do anticipate to design the all 6 cells, but as I mentioned earlier, construction will be phased into most likely 3 phases of 2 cells each. So we anticipate a construction project in this time frame to construct the first 2 cells and the supporting infrastructure. I also want to point out that DOE also has its own regulatory process, which we are working in parallel with the CERCLA process. And we hope to begin operations sometimes toward the end of 2022, early 2023. We need to have the new cell operational 18 months to 24 months ahead of filling up the old cell. So that's what this time frame represents. In summary, on-site disposal has been a key element of our success over the last decade. I think that is an important reason why we are where we are with the cleanup of ETTP. As we move from ETTP and go to RNL Y12, we are going to need additional capacity, and that's why we're here today. As I mentioned, on-site disposal is safer and more cost-effective than off-site disposal. We're now down to several sites in Bear Creek Valley. They involve greenfield sites, brownfield sites, sites that can accommodate the full range of projected volume, multiple sites, dual sites, two small sites that can accommodate the projected volume, a hybrid site, and the off-site disposal are part of the consideration in the RIFIS. We do hope to reach a regulatory decision by the end of FY17. This will allow us to optimize our cleanup schedules and integration. We have been fortunate to be blessed with sufficient funding this year and hopefully next year. If that continues, we want to be ready to keep moving by having the on-site disposal facility in place. So getting to a regulatory decision to allow that to happen will help mitigate the program risk to make sure we're ready to keep the program moving forward. As I mentioned, public and stakeholder involvement are a key part of the process. That's very important to us. Also, as I mentioned, we're going to be trying to get out in the community and inform the public as much as possible ahead of the proposed plan. To that end, I think ATIBA has agreed to sponsor a public meeting to talk about EMDF. Once those details get worked out, those will be shared.
It'll be this summer.
It'll be this summer, okay? So I think that's it for me, and I believe it's time for questions.
Thank you very much, Brian. Appreciate it. My prerogative, I'm going to go ahead and start. I'd like you to address, just for briefly and broad brush, if you like, the waste acceptance criteria for an on-site disposal facility, basically for the benefit of everyone here. How hazardous is the material that you would be putting into an on-site facility that would be in our local communities?
Okay. Well, there are several components to the waste acceptance criteria and several considerations that go into that. To start with, we're dealing with low-level waste as opposed to high-level waste and spent nuclear fuel and some of the more higher activity waste. So we're starting off with low-activity waste. We reached agreement with the WAC, the waste acceptance criteria, with the regulators. What sets the basis for that is some modeling to determine and ensure that the waste that goes in there remains protective and that the risks to future generations out, past 1,000 years and even longer, meet the circular risk range. So essentially, we limit what can go in to make sure that we stay within the risk to future receptors that is required under CERCLA, and that's the really small risk. There are other considerations that go into the waste acceptance criteria. We have made the decision that DOE doesn't have classes, but the NRC has classes of waste, class A, B, and C, and then greater than class C, and I won't really go into those right now, but we have made the decision at DOE that our on-site disposal facilities will not accept what's equivalent to greater than class C waste. So when I talked earlier about, the majority of the activity going off-site, and that's only a small percentage of the volume, that represents the high activity and the high hazard stuff. So what stays on site is really at the lower end. I guess I could speak to it best possibly by saying that, for the workers that are there day to day at our on-site disposal facilities, they essentially do not get any dose. So the waste is low enough activity that essentially there's not any dose. So we go through a rigorous process both with our regulators here and with DOE headquarters regulators to ensure that we've sufficiently modeled and ensured that there's a reasonable expectation that we're not presenting an unacceptable risk to any members of the public.
Okay, thank you. Go ahead and go around the table and start with Mary.
Okay, hi, thank you for your presentation. I have one question, and that is, you said the disposal facility is nearing capacity. I was just wondering, is there a projected date that you think that it'll be at capacity?
There is, there's a date range that we expect it to be in capacity. Okay. Our projections right now would put us in the mid-2020s for the existing on-site disposal facility. I think I mentioned earlier about we're potentially pursuing a cover redesign, which may give us a little more additional capacity in that existing facility. So that may change that date a little bit. But for the most part, that's mid-2020s based on where we are today. And a lot of that's dependent on future funding and how successful we are.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to Bob next. Your tent was up before me.
Okay. Thank you, Brian, for a very thorough and informative summary there. One of the things you talked about in great detail was the surface water drainage and control of drainage and what's available for the different alternative sites. Can you, and I know there's been concern in some of the public here in Oak Ridge about the potential for groundwater contamination from a site like this or from the existing sites. Can you, or some of your colleagues here, give us a little bit of a summary of that?
Essentially, as I mentioned, we do modeling of the on-site disposal facilities to ensure that they're protective. DOE headquarters does an annual review of all the disposal facilities to make sure they're protective. As part of the requirements, we have monitoring wells that essentially ring all of our disposal facilities. We continually monitor and sample to check for any contaminant migration leaving the on-site disposal facilities. So there's essentially a defense in depth approach to ensure that the groundwater contamination is not migrating out of the area where the disposal facilities are located.
Yeah, a slight follow-up.
Yeah.
Can you just say in a couple of words what the direction of general groundwater flow is in this area?
Certainly. As I mentioned, our geology lends itself to distinct watersheds, and for Bear Creek Valley, essentially for all of the sites, the water is flowing from the ridge's end and flowing west down the valley into the heart of the reservation. The northern ridge, which serves as a watershed boundary, prevents any water from flowing in that direction. And the city of Oak Ridge is essentially in that direction. So you have a really good distinct divide for groundwater that prohibits water from the Bear Creek Valley disposal sites from going toward the city.
Yeah, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Brian, you might want to add, in response to Bob's first question, a brief discussion about our different collection systems, the contact water and the leachate and whatnot, and how that helps to also protect the groundwater.
Okay. So, as I mentioned when I was taught, well, I probably didn't go in a lot of detail on the liner system, but, these on-site disposal facilities are lined. They have what's called a leachate collection system underneath the landfill and what's called a leak detection system under the landfill. We also have contact water basins, so any water that falls into the cell and comes in contact with the waste on the surface can collect in a contact water basin. We pump out that water into holding tanks and holding ponds. We sample it to make sure that it meets all the release criteria. All of the water that filters through the waste and through the cell ends up in the leachate collection system. Currently, all of that water is sampled and sent to a treatment facility on ORNL. And so that helps to ensure protectiveness. And another thing I didn't mention is there are lots of engineered features, no matter where we site this facility, to deal with rerouting the surface water and intercepting groundwater potentially. I mentioned the under drains, but there will also be line diversion ditches, some trench drains, and we've actually learned some lessons from our existing on-site disposal facility about how to handle water, and we're applying those to the future facility.
Very good.
Thank you again, and I kind of have a two-part question, so patience. You've offered us 5 suggestions right here, A, B, C, D, and E. In your summary, you didn't say which of those 5 is your preferred.
Okay.
Do you have a preferred?
At this point, the previous versions of the RFRA selected a preferred site. This version of the RFRA, we worked with the regulators and determined that this version would not select a preferred site. It would present the alternatives, and we will work with EPA and TDEC to reach agreement on what would be the preferred selective alternative for inclusion into a proposed plan. That hasn't occurred yet. Hopefully, we'll be working hard at that over the coming months.
Okay, and the second half is 8 months ago, give or take, we took a tour of what I believe is the brownfield facility, and you were part of that. And we discussed a lot, and memory serves me right, we've already spent $1.6 million to determine the viability of using that facility.
We did do what was called the Phase 1 characterization
Yes.
effort of that site.
Have you done that of the other 4 sites that you've outlined here?
So one of the others, Bear Creek Valley has lots of existing information, lots of existing wells. The West Bear Creek Valley site has had a lot of information and study done at that location because of past investigations. The locations in between for 6B, we know a lot about that because it's right next to the existing facility. 7A, we don't have quite as much information, but essentially what we're trying to glean from that is where is the groundwater? So we basically assume that the groundwater is near the surface, and we're trying to get an idea of, the surface water runoff. And we have a pretty good idea of what it's pretty consistent. It will change a little bit in varying locations, but essentially all of these alternatives involve building above grade. So that when I talked about the geologic buffer and I talked about the liner system, there's a minimum of 15 feet
Yes.
that goes above the ground and above the groundwater to ensure protectiveness. Now, part of the next step as we pursue a selected site is to do another round of characterization to go in for whichever site is selected and get a lot of additional data, including characterization data. But it will be a lot more information. Phase 1 for the particular site was a very limited effort. So we'll do the full suite of investigation to inform the design of that site.
Thank you. That's pretty close.
Thanks, Brian. Great presentation. Say, I guess from the existing facility, we have learned a whole lot, not only on the process of pre-design, the design, the construction, and the operation now, right?
That's correct.
So quite a bit of that is probably going to be used again?
The lessons that we learned from that you referred to
Yeah.
are, we talk about that in the current remedial investigation feasibility study, and that's a key thing that will be applied to whichever site moving forward. We'll take the lessons we've learned from design, construction, and operation of the existing cell and apply those moving forward.
Okay. And I guess I'm looking at it more from a point of savings. If I have to design a facility of which I know a whole lot because I built one already. I'm operating one already. Some of the things in the design step and the construction step could be refined, streamlined.
Yeah, I think the basic design of the facility, no matter where it goes, is the same. What the design will have to do is tailor the specifics to the site topography and the particular aspects of a site. But, the 10-foot geologic buffer, the 5-foot liner system, and a lot of that, and the water collection systems, a lot of that is going to be common no matter where it goes. So you're right, a lot of that is already well known.
Has the technology improved the last 8 years, 10 years? New liners? I don't know.
We've done a recent look into that. I'm not sure there's been huge advances in technology. I would say that there's probably better understanding of some of the systems than there were 8 years ago.
If I remember, in 2008, I think under the EM20 program, there was a workshop that was done on landfills. And a slew of items that came out of it as far as recommendations and options on how to do this. Does DOE have anything in mind about a workshop in terms of prior to starting the design in terms of the facility itself? Maybe getting some experts along and saying this is what we're going to do, and I don't know.
You mean a mechanism to collect information that would help to improve the design of the facility?
Right.
Is that what you're referring to?
The construction and the operation even.
Right. So actually, I believe that Brian is right now either procuring the services or reaching out to procure the services of one of the nation's experts to assist us with the finalization of our planning activities and moving into the design. And I think we'll probably do as much as we can to reach out to other experts. I don't envision a workshop per se for the design work.
And if you allow me, another item I had is, in the event that we do go and stay on site, the savings over the life cycle of $800 million plus whatever dollars, that's a pretty good chunk. Is there any kind of a vision, I say, about using some of that money in the community somehow, the savings?
I'm going to defer that one to Ms. Kane.
Talking about
Yeah. So what
money.
what the savings does is it allows us to accelerate our cleanup program. So we, of course, are appropriated federal funds from Congress to use for cleanup. And if we are able to come up with a protective and more cost-effective option, what that means is that we are able to accelerate our cleanup activities and shorten the time until cleanup is complete, which is a benefit to the community.
Sure is.
So.
Well, thank you very much.
The other options that have been offered, when we were looking at the preliminary planning way back, we were looking at the site that would be your brownfield, right toward Y-12. Okay, these other three sites have come on or into the picture because I would think there were some comments, negative or whatever, that caused the thought process to go further. Can you identify what some of those thoughts were? The reason for looking at a dual site and also over here in the Greenfield area?
Okay, so I think the additional alternatives, and Jeff can help me with this if he wants to weigh in, but as we were working through the circle process and TDEC and EPA were commenting on the last version of the RFS, and we were trying to work through those issues, it became very clear that the state in general had some concerns about building over a stream. That was one of the things. And they typically a RIFUS doesn't select an alternative, so there was a thought that we should have more options out there for evaluation. I think there was also a desire. The two small options basically avoid construction over a stream, so that's part of why those two came into play. Once we looked at not screening out to one preferred alternative, when we looked at the West Bear Creek Valley site, it was, other than being in a greenfield, it was essentially comparable to our existing East Bear Creek Valley site. It didn't have the advantages of reusing the existing infrastructure, but it had the advantage of less impact to streams and seeps and surface water. So as we were working through it, it was a combination of things that led to the alternatives that are in there. And I think EPA and TDEC also wanted the hybrid option, which we included. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
You always wonder, well, what else came up that caused that additional thought? Okay, the other question that I have.
Since how
I'm sorry.
Brian mentioned that I might be able to add into this, I'll go ahead. And I did want to emphasize something that Dave said earlier, that these landfills are meeting legal requirements of many programs, including the Resource Conservation Recovery Act, Hazardous Waste Landfill Requirements, and TSCA. The RCRA acronym, hazardous waste landfills, establish the basis for the design of the liner system that includes a double liner and a leachate collection and a leak detection system, and monitoring for any releases over the long term, indefinitely. And that's an important aspect of any of these landfills. DOE can't go away. There's no walk-away option. However, under DOE's own orders and under the low-level waste provisions, they have to evaluate the what-if scenario if there is no maintenance of this site and the liners fail and the releases occur. And that's that waste acceptance criteria that we were talking about earlier, placing limits on the concentration of waste based on a fate and transport model and exposure of that release over the long term, very long term, thousands of years. So in that whole setup, what tends to be a kind of a key discriminator in terms of what sites are better is water, shallow water tables and the underdrain issue. And that really was a major factor in saying, well, we've got the current landfill and the one right next to it built on top of one of these tributaries that have a low but steady flow. There is some uncertainty over the long-term effectiveness of the underdrains, and what we really don't want is water table rise in the long term that, in particular, if DOE were to go away, could cause leakage into the waste, and where if it leaks in, it's going to leak out. And so you want to maintain a dry landfill. That's the advantages out west, but you see the cost associated with transporting everything out west. So we really wanted to look at more options on the table, and in particular, try to look at maybe some smaller sites that didn't have those same surface water challenges.
Okay, so with that said, out west, as far as on-site out west versus shipment out west, off-site, all right?
He meant shipping it off out west. Yeah.
Oh, is that what you meant? Off-site
Yes.
out
Yes,
west?
yes.
Out west to a arid, dry environment.
Okay, all right, and I was thinking the cost differences, but I won't even go there right now. The other thing I wanted to talk about or ask about had to do with the considerable amount of mercury-contaminated soil that we're anticipating coming out of Y12. Is that waste slated for the new cell?
Okay, so as Jeff mentioned, there are lots of regulations associated with the on-site disposal. And there are what are called LDRs, landfill disposal restrictions. And so any waste that's going to be destined for the landfill has to meet those. For mercury waste, they'll go through the process for the different waste streams. And let me start by saying, right now, we're projecting about, up to 2.5 million cubic yards. I think the volumes associated with the mercury waste are in the neighborhood of 125,000. So it's a small percentage of that. But even that, when they look at those waste streams, when the projects and the generators start making decisions on that, they'll have to determine whether the waste streams meet LDRs, whether they can be disposed of, whether they require treatment, and then they would have to go through the treatment alternatives. And only if it meets LDRs could it come to the landfill. So yes, it's possible that some of the mercury waste, if it meets LDRs, will go into the cell. The previous version of the RFS talked about one thing we call in-cell macro encapsulation. So one of the treatment alternatives is macro encapsulation. So we had put in an alternative to do macro encapsulation of mercury waste in cell. That came out of this version of the RFS, and we'll be having other discussions on that particular subject. But I think, it's important to remember that no liquid waste can go into any of the cells. No primary threat waste can go into the cells. When I say that, I mean liquid mercury cannot go into the cells. So it's only, mercury contaminated waste that meets the landfill disposal restrictions that can go in there.
Do you anticipate that the contaminated soil from Y12 will meet LDR?
Some may, others may not without treatment. So we anticipate that, until we get in there, I think we project a certain amount, and I don't have the cut, that some of that will require treatment. And I think for the soils, there was a pilot done to look at taking the soils and doing the, some words are escaping me, but it's basically heats it up and evaporates the mercury. And then you check it, and if it meets LDRs, then it could be disposed of.
Thermal absorption.
Thermal absorption. Thank you, Sue. So there will be, as part of, when those projects get underway, they will be done under CERCLA. So there will be significant efforts between EPA, TDEC, and DOE to make sure that we have plans in place to ensure that we're getting the right characterization data, to ensure that the waste streams are in their proper lanes, and to ensure that they're getting treated under the regulations and disposed of per the regulations.
Okay, so what I'm getting out of that is, yes, the mercury-contaminated soil will go into the cell, and it would be treated to meet the waste acceptance criteria. Am I summarizing that?
Landfill disposal restrictions.
Oh, landfill disposal.
Yeah, I
Okay.
just clarify to say that we believe that some of the mercury-contaminated soils will not meet the waste acceptance criteria and therefore would have to be disposed of at an off-site location.
Okay.
So not all of it.
Okay,
but-
that was what I was after.
Yeah.
50%, 25%,
Yeah.
most, or all?
And typically when we ship waste off-site for treatment, the company doing the treatment will also dispose of it, so it doesn't actually come back to the cell.
Mr. Henry, one last question. You mentioned that it would be a consensus of the Environmental Protection Agency, Tennessee Department of Environmental Conservation, and the Department of Energy and Environmental Management will make the final decision as to which cell. Community involvement going to be involved as part of this process, and how much?
Absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, we intend to get out with the community and share the information that we have right now ahead of the proposed plan. There is a modifying criteria under CERCLA that involves community involvement. And so when the proposed plan is issued, all the comments that comes in and the opinions of the community play a role.
Good, thank you.
We will have further opportunities to comment on this issue, obviously. And Brian, thank you very much for your time and for everyone that helped answer questions, and to the board for their questions. Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.